Frank Castle figured it'd be a while before he heard from Natasha and her worldwide squad of Red Room spies, but lo and behold, it wasn't even a few weeks after the sky fell apart due to the time stream entanglement that she found him in an open-air noodle shop nestled among Shanghai warehouses down by the flood-controlled walls along the Hangpu River. The towers gleamed in the night sky, their upper floors hidden by clouds as it had just started raining. "Your kind of neighborhood?" she commented as she took a seat opposite him. "Honest working people," Frank said. "Food ain't half bad either. I had better noodles on Canal Street, though. You stopped by to tell me I'm wanted in Shanghai, too?" "I found you because I need a word." Frank slurped his noodle broth. "We saw what happened in Tokyo. Maybe we should be working together," she spoke bluntly, causing Frank to crack a smile just long enough to let her see it. "I was kidding." "I'm not." He looked at her while recalling what he saw in the sky just a few minutes after he took out some rogue androids, apparently blowing up her mission. It looked like some so-called supervillain did something to the sky, like the old days in New York City when something crazy happened every other hour. Then the sky over Tokyo was different, and Frank couldn't kid himself. A lot of other things were different too. "So, what have you been doing since Tokyo?" she asked. Her tone told Frank that she already knew, so he played it straight. "Went back home for a bit, cleaned up some criminal scum. Then I thought maybe I could help them more by getting after Doom again. I kidnapped one of his engineers, tried to find out what he's working on in Doomstadt. Learned enough to know that I had to come to Shanghai." Frank pressed his thumb on a reader set into the noodle shop counter. He stood and turned his collar up against the rain and said, "Come on." By the time they got up on the flood wall, the rain was coming down in sheets. He couldn't even see across the river to the old international concession. "Been here before?" he asked Natasha. "I've been just about everywhere," she said. "First time I came to Shanghai was back in the 1980s. It's changed a lot." Frank nodded. Shanghai changed fast, and the 1980s were a long time ago. "I mostly stayed in the States after I got home. But once I got the treatment, life got a lot longer. Thought I had more scope, I guess, to take on some bigger problems, because the more things changed, the more I realized that the world was staying the same. Unless I changed it." He stood listening to the rain, thinking about it. He knew Natasha had undergone the same life extension treatments he had, but at the moment, it didn't seem to bind them together. She used her extra decades to retake control of the Red Room and become the leader of an international spy network. Talk about healing childhood trauma. On the other hand, Frank had used his time to escalate his war on criminal scum from street-level punks and neighborhood gangsters to international traffickers. He tracked them patiently over years, and when he had the right situation, he made them pay. "Sometimes I think maybe I should have stayed in New York. They do have good noodles." "Why are we here, Frank?" Frank pointed out at a row of piers across the Hangpu River, barely visible through the heavy rain and the mist coming up off the river. "Single stack, no containers on the deck, but it's riding real low. See it?" Natasha nodded. "That ship flies a Madripoor flag, but it's running cargo for Doom. Special cargo this time. It's headed out to the Philippine Sea. When it gets into international waters and it's far enough to avoid anti-missile systems, it's gonna launch a satellite. Something about locking down any space transport coming from Earth, if the engineer was telling me the truth." Which I think he was. "More than that, Frank, I think it has something to do with what happened in Tokyo." "Most likely." Frank knew it wasn't in his best interest to think too hard about the weirder things. Crime was crime, and he gravitated towards problems with permanent solutions. "Nice work, Frank. We had the ship pegged but didn't know what it was carrying." "Well, widow, I might spend most of my time getting rid of criminal scum, but I'm not too shabby at paying attention and gathering intel. I don't always go around indulging my trigger-happy vigilante impulses." He was giving her a hard time because she'd called him a loose cannon in Tokyo, and he was still mad about it. But she didn't take the bait. "So, sink it," she said instead. "I'm sure you've got a stash of goodies somewhere that'll do the trick." "Not at the pier. People work there. If I sink a ship at the port, it'll be weeks until they can work." He could see on her face that she hadn't thought about this. "Yeah, you've got to think about the regular person, the little person, law-abiding, trying to get through the day. In the Red Room, those people are all just collateral damage, am I right?" "Maybe in the old days. Now we're all collateral damage in somebody's plan, Frank," looking him dead in the eye. "Anyway, yeah, sinking it is the plan, just not here in the port. The other thing is, unless we blow it sky high, Doom can just salvage the satellite and put it on another boat." "Noted. So what's your plan?" "You serious?" "Yeah. We'll do it your way. Then I want you to hear me out." She stuck out her hand, and as he shook it, she said, Now can we please get out of the rain? Visibility in the Huangpu approached zero even in daylight, and at night it was like being in a sensory deprivation tank. Frank couldn't risk garnering attention, so no lights. Instead, he used passive sonar. The river's bottom was a junkyard, sunken boats and other lost industrial relics stuck in the silt. Frank's scuba suit sported an advanced rebreather instead of an old-fashioned oxygen tank, so he didn't give off bubbles and didn't have to worry about getting air hoses tangled up. The bulk of the ship loomed overhead, drawing maybe 12 meters of water. That didn't leave much space under the keel for Frank to work his way in and set the charges, but he was able to lay 12 of them, 6 on either side of the keel and then a bonus 13th at the very stern near the rudder. Each was a kilo of his own explosive concoction shaped to punch inward, and one perk of being at perpetual war for decades is you learned a lot about making your own ordnance. Widow had done some advanced surveillance and the hull wasn't armored, so the charges would each rip a hole the size of Frank's van in the ship's hull. Frogman work wasn't really his style. He'd done it a few times, but he wasn't a fan. About 100 years ago, he'd seen a guy eaten by a shark. The guy was murdering scum and deserved it, but that didn't make Frank love being underwater. After a careful swim back downriver and across to the industrial flats, he stripped off the scuba suit and Natasha helped him stash it near the seawall inside of an abandoned car. "Everything go okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Frank said. "Don't need a bath now." They didn't want to draw attention to themselves, so they stayed perched atop a Red Room safe house in the old French concession. Natasha piloted an infrared detector drone that stayed a few kilometers above and behind the old container ship as it wallowed through the Philippine Sea towards international waters. "There it is," Frank said as the ship's deck slid open, revealing a launch gantry that lifted towards vertical. The rocket was small, and Frank snorted when he saw the painted Latvian flag on its nose cone. "He's got an ego, doesn't he?" Black Widow observed as she held the drone control out to Frank. "You want to do the honors?" At that point, Frank took the control and patched the visual feed into a visor lens that he had been wearing for hours. The detector's view appeared before him like he was looking down from above and behind it. Smoke sputtered from the inside of the ship as the rocket's engines began their pre-ignition sequence. "Doom, you scum! I hope you're watching," Frank said as he triggered the detonator. The ocean around the ship heaved and the launch gantry tipped to a 20-degree angle. A moment later, a huge belch of fire blasted upwards from inside the ship as the rocket's engine ignited, but before it could lift off, the gantry swung again, smashing into the ship's superstructure, causing flaming wreckage from a second series of explosions to arc into the sky and fall into the sea in blasts of steam. The ship itself was setting fast, heeling over to port as its stem disappeared, and the rocket stayed in the gantry, thruster sputtering. Not 5 minutes after the charges detonated, the freighter and the rocket were gone, as if they never existed. "What's the depth here?" Frank wondered. 7,000 meters, give or take, Natasha said. "That satellite's not coming back up. Doom's going to be furious." "Better than him being happy," Frank set down the drone control and took off the visor. "Wait," Natasha said. She picked the control up again and watched the monitor. The water was still churning where the ship had sunk, but now as they watched, the ocean's surface really started to boil. Through the swirling foam, the rocket and its satellite payload rose slowly into the air. "You've got to be kidding me," Frank said. Wobbling to stay vertical, the rocket cleared the surface. Its thrusters flared brighter and brighter as it accelerated upward. Natasha touched a fast series of commands on the infrared detector's control, and the drone ascended in parallel with the rocket. "You planning to crash it?" Frank said. "That rocket's gonna be way too fast in a minute." "Yeah," she said, "but I don't need that long." She stood up from her controls, reaching into her gear with focused swiftness, and within moments, she lifted a massive weapon to her shoulder and took aim as the firearm announced electroplasm rifle charged. Electroplasm rifle? Partly Frank was wondering why she hadn't mentioned the drone was a flying target, and partly he was wondering where he could get an electroplasm rifle of his own. "My little fail-safe," Natasha said as she breathed deeply and fired the shot. On the screen, the discharge of the electroplasm rifle whited out the screen as it annihilated the rocket and the drone with it. From their perch, Frank watched fragments of the rocket spiral out of the sky, and below there was a massive fireball that dissipated into tendrils of smoke. Globs of electroplasma fell along with the wreckage, crackling as they hit the surface of the ocean. "A shame to lose the infrared detector," Natasha said, "but a small price to pay to finish the job." "You didn't trust me to get it done?" Frank said. "Of course I trusted you, Frank. You said you were going to blow up the ship, and you did." As she spoke, Natasha commanded the agents at the closest Red Room safe house to mobilize. Her spy network would make it disappear. "But I also know we're dealing with Doom here, and if there's one thing we all need to know, is that when you go up against Doom, you need a backup plan." "So?" she shrugged. He understood, even if he still felt like she should have told him she was doing it. Guess we ended up working together after all. Yeah, Natasha said. We should do it again. Maybe, he said. If this op is any indication, we've got some kinks to iron out. Also, I want an electroplasm rifle. She gave him a sideways smile, revealing nothing. I'm putting together a team, you know. A few people who aren't afraid of unconventional methods. Maybe they've got what you might call a checkered past. But now they're trying to do what's right for the little guy, like those dock workers back in Shanghai. They're able to go to work tomorrow. So doing good? Sticking up for the downtrodden? What are we, knights? Beats being driven by revenge and a death wish, Natasha said. Frank considered this. He'd forgotten what it had been like to not be on the warpath solo, and if the sky was falling, maybe he did need a hand. If you say so. Yeah. Okay, I'm in. Now, you can actually listen to some of the Public Eye's internal comms in Tokyo 2099, which is a mission for Season 0, but there's also several Fujikawa Mall uniform and Stark Fujikawa promos you can hear throughout the map. However, before we could talk about the rest of Captain America's potential Avengers 2099 lineup, there's a group of characters that has been completely left out of the lore so far, so it's time to get to the mutants, and I promise it'll all make sense by the end of this section.